Hi, everyone. Hi, Shanali.
Hey, Jake.
Welcome to AMC, American Center Moscow, for our conversation today about data-driven storytelling. I'm Jake Schoenfeld. I'm a communications consultant in New York City, and I'm here with Shanali Burke, who is in Washington, D.C., and we're excited to talk about data-driven storytelling and to answer any questions that our viewers might have. So if you have questions as we go through this discussion, please share them online, and we'll save some time to answer them towards the end of our session here. So I'd love to give Shanali a chance to introduce herself. She has an incredible background, was born in India, trained as an actress, and met her husband online in 1998, and then moved to the US in 2000. And so Shanali, you have such an interesting background. I would love to hear from you, how you became a marketing and communications expert of all things.
Thanks so much, Jake. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is really a treat to be here. So as Jake mentioned, I'm originally from India, and I have kind of a left brain, right brain background. My bachelor's was in economics, but I had acted since I was a child. And so that was something I pursued as a young person as well. And I was very involved in community theater. So I did my master's in theater. And I was a working actress and director when fate would have that I met an American online in 1998. This is pre-dating apps, pre-anything, it was like Hotmail classifieds. And that's what ended up bringing me to the United States, to the West Coast in 2000, which is where I started my career in this country. And I had worked in PR and marketing in India as a consultant. And I just, I always knew how important it was. Storytelling was important to me. That's why I went into theater, because to me, that is how people connect. And public relations and marketing is about telling those stories in a way that resonates deeply with your audience, and about helping to make a better world, both for yourself and for the people whose lives you're trying to impact. So I decided to make my career in that space when I moved to the US. And I started working at a small agency that fortunately did PR and marketing for theater. So that's how I started to understand the landscape in this country. A few years later, we moved to the DC area because my husband, who is now deceased, moved from a state position to a federal position and have been here ever since. Through the last couple of decades of my career, I've worked at other agencies, some large agencies, some large nonprofits as well. And what I found was that I was really drawn to working with mission-driven organizations, helping them tell their stories better, and using the technologies of our time to do so. So about 14, 15 years ago, I kind of fell into social media accidentally, and I became an early adopter of what was then known as Twitter. And I found it fascinating that we had these platforms that were enabled by technology, but that allowed us to connect instantly with people anywhere in the world, just as we're doing now. But if some of you might remember how revolutionary that technology was in the mid to late 2000s. So I became fascinated with this idea of technology that's for the people, because that's what technology always should do. It should help you bridge the distance between you and your goals, between you and other people. And I started to use that in my work, in PR, in marketing, in larger communications programs, to help people better understand what organizations were trying to do, why that would make a difference, and how they could help them get there. That led me to some early work in what's now known as influencer marketing for organizations like the United Refugees Agency and Oxfam America. It informed a large part of my work that I used in teaching. I teach at a well-recognized university here. And it also really in my interest and love for data and analytics, really understanding what data, how data helps us better understand people's behaviors and how they help us tell better stories. That all led me to most recently my work as leading marketing and communications and revenue actually for a large, well-respected theater in the DC area from which I have just concluded my tenure, and here I am today.
Wow, it's so amazing. You started in theater and most recently have ended up kind of back in the same industry, so full circle in some ways. Obviously, we're here to talk about data-driven storytelling, but you mentioned just now, that storytelling is important and it helps people connect. You know, perhaps you could share some, insights or experiences from projects or campaigns that you've worked on to help, explain why storytelling is so important and so powerful.
Absolutely, and that's a great question, Jake. It doesn't matter who we are, where we are, what we do, how old we are. The circumstances in which we live might be very different. But if you think of the development of the human race, stories are what have brought us together. You think of getting together after a hard day, you're telling each other stories about your day, or you go out for a meeting or an event, you end up telling each other about yourself. So stories are always what's connected human beings. And I think what's become even more important today, it's a little bit of it's so important that it's a cliche, because people will say, what's the storytelling? And we're going to help you tell your story better. But then what's the story? So if you think about stories, don't think about marketing or communications, but just think about stories. What are the fundamental elements of a story? There are characters. There's some kind of story arc. There's usually some kind of challenge that the protagonist has to overcome. Sometimes there are multiple challenges, and there is usually an ending. And my favorite stories are fairy tales. And if you think about fairy tales that you listened to or read or were told as a child, these are the common elements. There's a hero, there's a villain, there's a heroine, there's something they have to overcome, there's a community that's rallying behind them or that doesn't believe them, but they work through challenges to get to an outcome that they believe is going to be better than where they started. So if you've never actually thought about, and when I say you, I mean everybody on the call or who's listening to this, when you think about telling the story of your organization or your campaign or your project or your movement, I think it really helps to start to frame that story in light of who are the characters, who's the protagonist, who's a grand old sage, who are those archetypes that can help you frame what you're doing as a story so that it gets relatable to people. It's not always going to work. Sometimes you've just got to go out with the facts, but a lot of times thinking of it as a story will help you articulate better and more effectively why it's important to get to that outcome. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is going back a ways when I worked with, I mentioned the UN Refugee Agency, USA for UNHCR. And the campaign that I and my consultancy at the time was engaged to work on was called the Blue Key campaign, which was about generating awareness for an effort to raise awareness around refugee issues around the globe. And this was coming out of, a global refugee crisis at the time. So the organization had created a little pin that was about that big, that was in the shape of a key, and the color was UN blue, and it had the organization's logo on it. And you could buy it for $5 as a pin that you could put on your jacket or anywhere else, or as a pendant that you could string on a necklace. It would cost $5, and if you did that, it was a way for you to show support for the global refugee issue. Now, if you think about it from a fundraising standpoint, which almost all nonprofits and mission-driven organizations are doing in one way or the other, selling a lot of $5 pins is not going to get to a massive fundraising goal. But what it is a symbol of commitment. And it's a symbol that, I appreciate what you're doing. I support you. And by showing this pin or pendant, I'm willing to engage in a conversation with someone who might ask me about it. And that's how ideas spread, right? By people talking about them. That's Ted's tagline, ideas that spread. So one of the ways in which we decided to get the word out online, because that was specifically what I'd been engaged to do, was to look for people who were active online and who were very engaged with their communities. These days, we call that influencer marketing. That was in the early days of doing work like this. And so we look for people who are active on Twitter, on Facebook, on the platforms that were important at the time, who were active bloggers. But more than people who had large followings, we were looking for people who were really engaged with their communities. So we saw that there was conversation taking place. And we reached out and we said, we'd like you to join this initiative as a champion. We call them Blue Key Champions. And to become a Blue Key Champion, we ask you to commit to two things. One is to buy a pin or pendant. And we used the often used analogy of this is cheaper than your daily cup of coffee. And second, once you do that, please commit to talking about the campaign, writing a blog post, or creating some form of content in a forum in which you're comfortable and sharing that out with your followers. I think what was really important in those asks was that we never said we were going to control the message. We said we would give them information, but we made the asks simple. And what really started coming out of that, Jake, was people, once they understood the magnitude of the problem, which is where data came in, because there had been a lot of research that had been done that we could present to them, they were shocked at how huge this problem is globally. But then what also started coming out was their personal stories. People who had been uprooted, people whose families had been refugees, people who were refugees themselves due to a natural disaster in this country. And those stories were so powerful. And that really helped them bring an authenticity to their support of the campaign that I don't think we would have found otherwise. So that's one example. The second is more recent with Arena Stage, the fabulous theater company that I worked for the last few years. Arena Stage is very historic in not just Washington, D.C., but in American theater, because it is one of the it was the first integrated theater in the DC area. And it was also one of the real drivers of the nonprofit theater movement in this country. So it's been around since 1950. And a lot of times people forget that Arena has been iconic and important, not just in theater, but to the economic development of the District of Columbia itself. So as we started to re-energize its communications through the pandemic, what we wanted to do was not just say, we present and produce great theater on our 3 stages, but we are really fundamental to the resurgence and the economic vitality of this area. And so telling the stories of why Zelda Chandler, one of the co-founders, chose that location for the theater, or how we were first in XYZ, which made such a huge difference to theater around the country, became very important, so that people realized coming to Arena wasn't just to see great theater, but to be a part of living history. So those are 2 examples.
Those are awesome examples. And I love that it sounds like you found different or multiple storytellers for each campaign, so that the voice or the narrative wasn't always coming from an organization, but from people affiliated with it, people who have been impacted by it, all sharing their personal experiences, which is bound to help, make those stories resonate with a much broader audience.
Absolutely. And I think, what you just said is so important. And I think we are seeing this around the world. And this is one of the huge potentials that social has brought to us, that it is a way to bring community together like we have never seen before, because we can connect with each other 24/7. We can forge relationships across the ether that just literally wasn't possible before, because How do you form a relationship with someone if you can't talk to them, if you can't see them, if you
Right.
can't communicate with them? And the advances in technology, if you think about it, going back all the way to the Gutenberg press, every single advance in communication has been preceded by a significant and a dramatic change in technological evolution. And so we are now at this place in our world where we're not just communicating with each other, but we are communicating with artificial intelligence, or we're
Yes.
trying to, at least, and we're trying to understand how does this change our world. And I believe, we're barely touching the surface there. Um, but that is what is so, I think, powerful about doing the work we do
Yeah.
today. That we have technologies that have a low barrier to entry, maybe even a zero cost, in terms of engaging with people, and the potential to really engage and to drive conversation and storytelling is bigger than ever before.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Now, I think you left a few pieces out of your biography because, in addition to being, a marketing communications leader for multiple organizations, you're also an entrepreneur. You started your own consultancy. You mentioned that you were a teacher and have, shared all of your expertise with students over many years. But you've also been a student yourself, and if I'm not mistaken, went back to school recently to study business intelligence, to gain a better understanding, of data and analytics. But when we spoke earlier this week, you mentioned that you think of yourself as like a growth strategist, someone who can help organizations, dream big and build bigger. What does that mean to you? And what does that kind of work mean to you?
Thank you for asking, Jake, and thank you for filling in the blanks. You just it's tough to know how much you want to say about yourself, because it's like, oh, they're gonna get bored if I keep droning on. Um, I think I came up with this phrase of, yes, I'm a growth strategist, because I think all organizations, whether they are for profit or nonprofit, community, government, whatever, you want to grow. You want to have your programs take root. You want to you believe in some benefit from them, and so you want your audience or your intended audience to take advantage of them. You want them to sign on to do something, etc. Which means you have to grow. And to me, the beauty of data, and why I went back to school to study business analytics, is that if we start to understand the language of data, if we start to understand how to identify the data that sits all over an organization, we have more data available to us now than ever before. And most of us have absolutely or very little idea of what to do with it. Because it's scary. It's scary to think, oh my God, there's so much data. And of course, there's no shortage of horror stories or people trying to scare you. Well, they'll grab your data and do blah, blah, blah. Sure, they will. But also, that data can really be harnessed for good. So if we learn to figure out where the data sit in an organization, I'm still not used to talking about it in the singular as AP wants me to say, but I'll try. Whether that is HR data or, we tend to think of data only as marketing data, but everything, you've got marketing data, sales data, behavior, there's so much. So I think what becomes important is, okay, what are all of the places we could look for this data? Put that aside and then go, okay, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? What is this outcome that we're trying to drive towards? We want to grow. So we want to become bigger to do X, Y, Z. What are those X, Y, Z? And then say, okay, what data do we need to know about to help us get there? And then start finding them. And then once we find them or know where to look for them, say, okay, how are we going to structure this so that we can easily or more easily analyze it to get the insights we need to help us grow? And so I like to say, as you referenced, that I help purpose-driven organizations dream big and build bigger. And to do that, you have to, I believe, find that sweet spot of data and storytelling, because that's what's going to help you take those big dreams and build something bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been lucky to have had a career working for purpose-driven organizations, which must be extremely rewarding given some of the causes that you've mentioned. Marketing and communications more broadly is often about selling a product or service, and I know you've said that that can be tricky or difficult for some people. How does storytelling relate to this idea of sales, and why do you think sales, despite being maybe a dirty word in some circles, is really important, not just for storytelling, marketing, communications, but maybe for everyone?
Sales is, this is going to sound a little bit trite and cliche, but sales is life. When you are interviewing for a job, you're selling yourself. When you are going on a date, if you really like that person, you are trying to put forward the best version of you that you can, so that that person will say, hey, I want to see you again. All of that is sales. And I used to be very anti-selling or sales, because I think there's this popular conception that if you build it, they will come. Yeah. That is just not, I'm not going to say that's not true, but that is not usual, because there's plenty of things that have been built and that nobody is going to see. The differentiator is when people's interest is sparked and they feel that by going to see that site or engaging in that course or buying that product or signing on for that subscription, that is going to change their life in some way. And I don't think most of us are sitting around going through our email subscriptions going, oh, this is going to change my life if I read this blog or this newsletter. Very few of us are actually sitting around and doing that. But our lives are being changed, because what we consume, what we do, that impacts how we think and then who we are and how we present in the world. So it was actually my second business coach when I was an entrepreneur. And we were working through some roadblocks. I had some mental roadblocks around a sales cycle, an online sales cycle that was very important to the online course that I was actively selling at the time. And I said, yeah, I'm really having a hard time with this. Like, it feels really salesy. And she said, Shonali, anytime, do you believe this course has value? And I was like, absolutely. It helps you do blah, blah, blah. If you're a student, if you're a marketing professional, blah, 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 blah. She said, then why wouldn't you want more people in this field to know about it? Because it can help them solve all those things. And she really helped me see that when you are selling to solve someone's problem or to help them do something better, that is really a very high form of service. And that was a huge mental switch for me. And that's what I try to really impart in my teaching, in my work, when I'm mentoring young people or anyone else, and kind of get out of this mindset that, selling is bad and, oh, I don't want to be salesy. I think there's a way to do it. If you meet someone for the first time at a networking event, for example, you're not going to say, oh, I sell this, buy one of these things, otherwise I never want to see you again. You're not going to say that. You are going to try to, I hope you're not going to say that. You're going to try to find out who they are, what they do, how can you help them? I think the key is internalizing that question. How can I help you? How can I be of service? Sometimes the answer is not what I have to provide. Sometimes the answer is an introduction. 2 days ago, I caught up with someone I've known, for 15 years now, and I haven't seen her in a long, long time. And I realized that a more recent connection of mine now works at that same organization, which is a large university. And this person is new in the organization, new in the area. And so what I did was I was like, oh, you guys should talk. Yeah. And so I did an email introduction. I get nothing out of this, absolutely nothing. But it made me feel good because I was helping someone. And so I think that is what is really important for us all to remember, that a sale is not a bad thing. money is not a bad thing because it helps us do the work we want to do and help organizations we want to grow. And I think if we keep that focus on service and on being helpful at our core, then it's hard to go wrong.
Yeah. So sticking with that theme of growth and service, I know that you were at like the forefront of applying measurement techniques to PR, which was a discipline that 20 years ago was not so easy to measure. People looked at how many stories got picked up by which news outlets, and maybe how many people followed or watched or read those programs. But new technologies gave us new ways to look at the impact of PR and communications. So can you tell us a little bit about how new media has changed the way we think about measurement, and how you approach it?
Yes, I can. And you'll have to just kind of, raise your hand if I start to just go off on a tangent, because this is an area that I love to talk about. We have, as I said earlier, we have more ways to connect than ever before. We have more data at our fingertips than ever before. And we have very easy access to analytics that, Google Analytics is free. And you have plenty of other programs and platforms that give you very sophisticated analytics. But if you don't have the budget for that, there are three things that when I was speaking a lot more and teaching a lot more on measurement, I would say there are three tools that are completely free. One is Google Analytics. The second is a spreadsheet, so you can decide whether you like Microsoft Excel or the Apple version or Google Sheets, whatever it is. And the third is your brain. These three things are completely free because you're using some version of them in your daily life. And what then becomes important, so you can't say, I don't have the tools. I think what it goes back to is, do I want to know? What do I want to know? And do I want to know? And those things are scary. Because I think historically, and even now, there has been a focus on outputs, what we're putting out there, what we're generating. As you said, so we're generating a story and impressions and reach and this and that. Great. What did that do? Was it supposed to drive traffic to a particular landing page? Was it supposed to encourage people to sign up for something? Were you looking for downloads of something? What was all of that supposed to do? And those answers will be different depending on your campaign and your organization. But if you can't connect or start to find ways to connect them, then why are you doing it? Why are you expending all of this time and energy and money? Because even if the tools are available and don't cost a fee, your time is money. Your staff, consultants, anybody you're working with, there is an opportunity cost to that. And why are we spending time doing things if we don't know what they're driving? I think the process of trying to answer that question can be very scary for organizations, and I completely understand that. Because it's so much safer to just stay in the place of, this is what I'm used to doing, this is what I know how to do, and let me just keep doing this because it makes me feel good that I know how to do this. Because when you start asking those questions about what am I trying to do here, what are the outcomes I'm trying to drive, you're kind of thrown into a whole field of unknowns, and that is very, very fear-inducing. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and then just go, okay, but how are we going to move forward in this discovery phase together? So that's a very long background to the question you asked, but that's why I think it's really, really important. What I'm a little nervous about in terms of new media and new ways of doing things is that if there is not a true understanding and acceptance of the fact that we are trying to move to certain outcomes and what kind of metrics are valid and what are not, we can get very close to the place of really bad metrics that were being used across the field, particularly in PR, that were being used with impunity as recently as 10, 15 years ago. For example, add value equivalency, saying if I generate a story in the Times, there is this big blah, blah, blah. It would have cost me this many advertising dollars to generate that story. Guess what? That's complete nonsense, because you could not, let's say that your goal was to get a story in, the front page of the New York Times. You cannot buy that.
Right.
So this entire concept of add value equivalency, which a lot of marketers helped to perpetuate, is complete nonsense. And what scares me about the facility that new technology gives us, that a lot of analytics, is that people who have not really spent the time to understand what valid metrics are simply say, oh, if you get this, then it could be worth that. And that's anathema to me. And so that's what really scares me about the new media and access to new technologies, that if you don't invest in really understanding what valid outcomes are, then you're really not ahead of the game anyway.
Right. And this may be an impossible question to answer, but I can't help ask it now, given what you said. Like, how do you think about the value of a front page story in the New York Times? I would probably agree that you can't ascribe like a dollar value to it, but when you think about the power of that story to shape people's opinion or the way they think about an issue or a product or a service, how do you think about that value?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really important one, because I think, and I truly believe that what I would rather call legacy media than conventional media or old media are even more important today, even though there's been so much shakeup in the media landscape, and there will continue to be. But, particularly as trust continues to be picked apart, what do you trust? Who do you trust? I mean, what information sources do you trust? That's a whole other ball game today, right? Than it was even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But there is something about legacy media that makes people go, well, I heard this, I saw it on social, so-and-so texted it to me, I saw it on a WhatsApp group, let me go check the website of blank, blank, blank. And so if you're going to check the website of blank, blank, blank to see if that's true, that should tell you that that is an information source that instinctively you trust.
Right. It validates information that may have come from other sources.
Exactly. And I think what is also really important is that, to me, trustworthy and reliable media sources or information sources will also be transparent about their sources. Is this first-hand information? Is it primary research? Did they directly do an interview? Where did they get the information from? So when you then think about, okay, when you're putting your media mix together or your marketing mix together, and I was just having this conversation with my fiance earlier this morning, his business has nothing to do with marketing. It's a very much a tangible business, which I just love. I love that. It's literally about building things to make people's lives better.
Widgets.
No, actually, furniture. And he was asking my opinion about, potentially advertising in a specific legacy media source in the future as he thinks about expanding his business. And I thanked him for asking my opinion. And then, of course, I talked for probably 15 minutes longer than I should have. But the point is, but essentially what I said was, one, you have to test it. You don't know until you've tested.
Yeah.
By testing, I mean that the communication, whether it's an ad, whether you're generating editorial, whatever you're generating, has to have some kind of call to action, and some way for people to go, a phone number to call, a landing page, something for them to do. And then, are you tracking what's happening on that end? So are you looking at how many signups you get or how many phone calls you get? The second thing is, a lot of times, awareness, whether it's paid or earned in legacy media, can lead to thinking about something a lot before you actually do something, and you don't really remember the first time or where you heard about it the first time. So the other thing that I have worked very hard in my work to do is to make sure we're asking the question, where did you hear about us? Because that can help you connect the dots as well. And then the third part of this, which goes back to the question you asked, is when you're thinking about your outcomes, yes, you want to drive sales, you want to drive, signups, downloads, customers of some kind. But I suspect you're also trying to drive a change in brand perception in some way. You're trying to drive some kind of brand elevation. Maybe you're trying to expand how your brand is thought of. You're trying to expand the demographics in which your brand is part of the conversation. And so I think it's really important as you're creating your menu, as it were, of outcomes, key performance indicators by which you're going to gauge the success or progress of your work, you identify what that means as well. And that's where the stories, I think, become really powerful. I would challenge anyone to say that they saw something on the front page of whether it's the Times or the Post or whoever it is, a significant established legacy media outlet that did not make them think or do something else, even if it's, I don't want to hear about that. Right. I don't agree with what they're saying. I'm going to go find something else. It does change. It does impact your thinking.
Yeah. Going back to some of the data that we were talking about, we live in a world, like you said, where data is everywhere. There's so much of it. When you're thinking about how to use it, whether that's in a story, to tell a story, or to measure the impact of a campaign or story that you've told, like, how do you know what to look at and what to ignore?
How do you know which data to look at when you're
how do you decide what matters and what doesn't? What is a real signal and what is noise?
That's a great question. And of course, there are statistical ways to do that, but most of us are not sitting and running, a bunch of R code or something. I think it will require you to have identified the foundational message points for your program or campaign. So, for example, when I was working on developing Arena Stage's foundational messaging, because it was important for us to remind people, not just our existing theater audience who knew us, but attract new audiences to the theater, that we weren't just some fancy building or interesting. It's a beautiful building in DC. Very interesting architectural building, that we weren't a library, because you could see when you walk by it, there's like a particular part of the building where you could see a lot of books. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times people walking by go, oh, that must be a library or a community center. And when we heard that, I was like, whoa, that's interesting. So we needed people to know we weren't a library. We needed people to know we are a vibrant, thriving theater that is a huge part of DC's ecosystem, and that we were and are seminal in the nonprofit theater movement and in the growth of nonprofit theaters around the country. And that, in fact, Arena Stage, through its community outreach programs, has impacted theater around the world. All of those are true things. And all of those are fundamental to Arena Stage's story of why it was important and why it remains important moving forward. So once you've identified that, like when we said, okay, this is a very important piece of our messaging, I call the messaging pillars. What are the data points that then help me flesh this out into a story? Is it how many programs we do? Is it how many people come through the doors of our center? Is it by a process of correlation or extrapolation, how much we contribute to the economic value in our area of the organization, or when we train this many people in our education programs, how we contribute to the growth of arts educations and to train future arts administrators. And you can see how all of that then helps us go, well, what are the numbers here?
Yeah.
How many people come through this program? How many theaters did they go on to work in? Where are they now? All of that's data. I think the other thing to remember, and for everybody watching this, is to remember that data can be quantitative, so the numbers that we're talking about, but also qualitative. And the stories that people will tell you, when I was a kid, I went to do this at Arena Stage, and then that helped me in my career as a chartered accountant because it taught me blank skills.
Yeah.
And now I send my kids to the summer program. That's data as well. And those are stories people are freely giving to you. So it's really important to kind of have a way to capture those stories. And 9 times out of 10, maybe even 10 times out of 10, if you go back to someone and say, I really love that story that you told me about your experience of my organization, I would love to share it and to showcase it. What do you think about that? Almost always, I've never had someone say, no, I don't want to help you tell your story by telling my story.
Right. Especially when they have a positive story to tell.
Exactly. I mean, and the other thing about, you'll have negative stories, right? So I think this is where...
That's what Yelp is.
Say that again?
That's what Yelp is for.
Yelp and Reddit also, right?
Exactly.
And if you've noticed, though, when you've seen those negative reviews on Yelp, the business owners or the people who are paying attention and reaching out to the commenters, to the reviewers, are the ones who then use those data points to either improve something about their service or to convert back a customer, because nobody is complaining about you because they don't want to be heard. In fact, I would say that if people are complaining about you, they actually really care about your product or service, because they care enough to say, hey man, this is not what I expected. What happened? I do better.
Yeah.
And I think what makes, as a consumer, what would make me feel really good is if that organization reached out and said, I'm really sorry you had this experience. What can I do to make it better?
Now, I want to ask one more question before we open it up to questions from the audience. But I want to use this as an opportunity to remind our viewers that they can submit questions. So if you have questions for Shonali, please submit them now, and then we will get to them after the following response. But you mentioned earlier us connecting with technology, having conversations, and now we're talking to AI. So I don't think it would be possible to have a conversation today about communications without addressing AI and the algorithms that inform a lot of the information and stories that we see. I'm curious how you think these new technologies have changed the game, and what might remain unchanged.
Well, I'll answer that extremely good question that we definitely cannot go in depth into now, because really that's going to be a thought exercise, right? Because even the person who knows most about AI knows this much. What hasn't changed, or what won't change, I believe, is humanity and the need for human connection. I actually think that's going to get more and more important and more powerful. I think we have already seen that. Certainly in the arts, we are seeing it. I think across the board, we coming out of the pandemic, we experienced as human beings collectively in real time for multiple years what it means to be isolated and not to be able to physically connect with people. And when you were allowed to do it on a really limited basis. And I do believe that that's still going to take us years to really come out of, though we have certainly started. And if anything, that showed us how important that human connection is. So I feel that the organizations that will leverage AI more successfully than others will remember to keep people and humanity at their core. Remind me, the first part of your question was like, how is that going to change things?
Yeah, how does it change the game for people in our profession, for telling stories like we've talked about?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some at the fundamental level, there are efficiencies that that can be created, or have been created, and that I think would be very beneficial to take advantage of, whether it's something as simple as AI that helps analyze a video meeting and give you a summary and give you suggested next steps, or to generative AI. I mean, it's all generative AI, but that helps you research more efficiently. And that, I'm not going to start, I will try not to name, a gazillion platforms, because first of all, I don't know all of them, and we only have so much bandwidth to use them all. I think there's a lot of fear around AI being adopted, and I forget which large organization just announced, X number of jobs that are going to be moved to AI. And so the fear that, or that, where they're cutting back on people because of technology, essentially. I think that's what we've seen throughout history, right? It's just that it's happening at a scale that is, to use a word that is very cliched now, unprecedented.
Yes.
So how do we use AI efficiently? How do we leverage for efficiency? How do we, however, also make sure that people aren't left behind? Because I'm not a doomsdayer. I'm also not completely Pollyanna-ish, but I think there's a very real fear that large swaths of the human race are going to be completely left behind and not retrained or reskilled in a way to help them um, make a livelihood, help them earn a livelihood, if what they've known to do for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years is taken away from them. I feel that's our responsibility as human beings. I feel it's really important that all of us who are in any position of management or authority, and as we're looking to leverage efficiencies and to leverage the power of AI, what are we doing to make sure we aren't leaving human beings behind?
So I started to see some questions come in from our viewers. The first one I have here is, how do you balance creativity and data in your marketing campaigns?
I love that. I love that question. How do you balance creativity and data in your marketing campaigns? So, with the creativity piece, what I've always encouraged my team to do is just come up with every idea you can. Okay, if this is the story, this is the campaign, what are some creative ideas? And a creative brainstorm, there's no bad idea. So then what we do is, once we've had, 50 ideas on the table, say, okay, how do we start to streamline these? What can we implement quickly? What makes sense? What do we think is going to resonate with our audience or whoever it is we're trying to impact in this program, based on what we know?
Mm-hmm.
There's some historical data that you can point to. If you don't, then you've got to try a bunch of things and see what works. And that's where the data part comes in. And that's where, if you're looking at your analytics, whether it's email analytics or web analytics or whatever it is, whatever your markers are, I think that's really helpful, because then it's telling you that this creative idea was better, or not going to say better, this creative idea was more effective in this form of communication than this one. And that's what we call A/B testing. And you can A/B test pretty much anything and everything. what is really important for those of you who might be new to getting started with analytics and A/B testing is to only test one thing at a time. So if you're testing two different ways of sharing a creative idea, whether it's a headline in an email, only test the headline, because otherwise you don't have a control. Don't test the headline and the color of the button and the this and the that all at the same time, because you're not going to know. You might be, oh, that worked great, but I don't know which of these things made a difference. And it can be really laborious and it can be really frustrating. But it can also give you some really, really good information.
Yeah, I love that. So be as creative as possible and then use the information that you have already to basically narrow down your choices, help you decide what you're going to actually try, and then again, use data to evaluate the effectiveness of what you have
Exactly.
decided to do. Yes, that's great. I'm looking at some of the other questions here. What else do we have? How do you stay up to date on like all of the rapidly changing, trends and industry landscape?
That's such a great question, and I don't know if I have a good answer for it or one that will be satisfactory. Because there's a part of me that wants to say you can't. There's like literally too much information up there. I think it is impossible for you to truthfully say I'm completely up to date. No, because 5 seconds ago something happened that took what you were thinking an hour ago and made it out of date. So if we're going to be semantically accurate, you can't. But let me not be that person. I think it goes back to getting very focused about what you want to stay up to date on, and then what your information sources are going to be. And it's kind of like how we set up a listening program in PR and marketing. We say, what are we going to listen for? So for example, I had a client in my consulting days where we were trying to understand how their work, which was in health science research, was perceived by certain audiences. And so then that means, who are those audiences? So you've got to identify those audiences. And then you've got to say, well, where do they congregate? Where do they communicate? And so then you've got to identify your channels. And then you've got to say, well, what are the kinds of words or what's the kind of language that they might use to describe this work? And an exercise like that is hugely informative, because what often you'll find is that what you think you're saying is not what people are hearing. And that's the bridge that you have to have in marketing communications, right? You've got to know that what you are saying and what you mean to say is what people are actually hearing and absorbing. Yeah. So you've got to then identify, okay, if this is what I know I want to stay updated on, how am I going to gather that information and what am I going to listen for? So for me, for example, what that means is, when it comes to AI and data science, I have certain newsletters that I subscribe to via email, certain writers that I follow on Medium or Substack or, plenty of other platforms. And from my colleagues and my cohorts, my professors, whom I'm paying attention to on their preferred social media or communication platforms. I think you also have to give yourself some grace and just say, this is what I can do now. This is what I can do now. And see what you're learning, see how you're feeling. Anything that leads to a feeling of overwhelm or panic, you should just not do.
Yeah. I think those are great suggestions. There's so many amazing newsletters out there, like Substack. Once you find one, it'll recommend others that are similar. If you find people on X or other platforms that you follow, you also see who they follow, so you can easily, start finding the voices that you want to be listening to. I love that.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question, which kind of comes up a lot in conversations in the marketing world, like personalization.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how important is that, you think? And what would you say are the best ways to achieve that?
I think it's very important. I think that there's always a trade-off for anything in life. And, kind of going back to when I talked about opportunity cost, for those of you who have any economics background, it's when you spend the time to do X, what are you giving up? And I think the old Adam Smith example maybe was it in Econ 101 is like guns and butter. Like, if you are gonna buy this many guns, how much butter are you not gonna buy? So I was like, okay, that's an outdated example if ever there was one. But any level of personalization will require time. And so I think you have to recognize that. I think you also have to recognize that without moving to some level of personalization and being able to really streamline your funnels, you are likely not going to grow beyond a certain point. Now, that might be okay. It might be fine for you to get to whatever that's going to get you. But my opinion is that if you want to keep growing and keep fine-tuning and keep finding new ways of bringing audiences in and expanding your market share, there will need to be personalization. Now, on email, that could be things like using certain fields, making your emails seem more personal, segmentation that looks at the actions people are taking in specific types of emails and moving them along different paths, so that even if your goal is to, let's say, sell widgets, maybe how you're talking to this group of people about those widgets is different than how you're talking to this group of people about those widgets. And you won't know that until you experiment and actually change up your communications and have kind of a sequence of communications, which goes back to that creativity in marketing as well. You have to be tracking it again, because if you don't know the actions people are taking, which emails are getting opened, which are not, which ads are getting click-throughs, which are not, then again, it's a crapshoot, right? So the answer is yes.
Yes. I see we only have a couple minutes left, so hopefully there's time for one more quick question here. What do we got? Oh, I think some of these might be a little too complicated, but let's see if we have time. So, what are the best practices for improving retention rates in nonprofit donations? And how can nonprofits encourage people to donate more regularly?
That's a really, really great question. Well, you've got to have a baseline, first of all. So if you don't know what your retention rate is, if you don't know what your customer lifetime value is, you've got to do those calculations, and that's not difficult to do. You just need to have someone working with you to put that structure in place. I think it's really important to segment your different levels of donors as well. If you're doing individual donors, major gifts, etc., and what are your retention rates amongst, and they're going to be different, like how the effort you expend, a level of personalization that you expend on a major institutional donor or major gifts, for example, is going to be very different than how you're approaching individual giving, for example. In my experience, and also my opinion, is when you make people feel important, what they are doing, how they are giving to you is really important, and you are being grateful and thanking them, and then you give it a break before asking them again, that is more likely to lead to a longer term relationship and both a higher and a longer customer lifetime cycle and value than if it's a constant, we don't have money, because then people are going to go, well, what are you doing with all this money that I'm giving you?
What are you doing with the money I'm giving you?
Like, you are really bad at managing money. I don't think I'm going to give you any more money. I'm going to go give it to your competitor because they're not asking me 50 times a day.
No, that's a great answer. I think we're about at time here, so I want to take a moment and thank our viewers for tuning in. Thanks for all the amazing questions, and of course, thank you, Shonali, for such a fascinating and engaging discussion.
Oh, it was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you, Jake, and thank you to the organizers and to everybody who streamed in. I know this, I don't take your time lightly, and for you to give up an hour of your evening or wherever in the world you are of your day I know that is an investment, and I really appreciate it. And I hope that this was helpful and enjoyable.
Thank you so much.